everyone. My name is Norman Goda. I am the director for the Center of Jewish Studies here at the University of Florida. Tonight's event is what we call a keynote address. And a keynote address is usually sort of the central point of an academic conference. And for the past day and tomorrow, we have been having a conference called Universalizing the Holocaust. We've assembled scholars from literally all over the world, and we have been discussing different takes on this very controversial issue, which has become rather polemical of late. And it's our expectation that a book will come from this. And before introducing tonight's speaker, I have a few people to thank. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Norman and Irma Bremen, who generously supported this conference, but in fact, who have generously supported indefatigably Holocaust studies for the last 15 years here at the University of Florida. Much of what we do in Holocaust studies, we owe to Norman and Irma Bremen of Miami. I would also like to thank our staff at the Center for Jewish Studies, Sandra James, Amanda Bouquet, Elizabeth Petty, Alexa Jodon, and Alexander Lowy. Anything that's gone right in this conference in terms of organization is 100% because of them and 0% because of me. And I very much appreciate their help. I also want to thank my colleagues from the center for moderating panels, Roy Holler, Gail Zachman, Natalia Alexion, Rachel Gordon, and Yaniv Feller for moderating our discussions. But now I would like to invite our keynote speaker, and this is really special for me because we were classmates at one time longer ago than either one of us would care to admit. And we've stayed friends over the years, and this is her first time in Gainesville. Doris Bergen is the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolfe Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research centers on religion, gender, ethnicity in Holocaust and the Holocaust and the points of connection in and across historical episodes of extreme violence. Dr. Bergen has held research grants from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the German Marshall Fund, the German Academic Exchange, and the Alexander Humboldt Foundation. And of course, she also has several books. Her first one was Twisted Cross, the German Christian Movement in the Third Reich. She is also the author of War and Genocide, A Concise History of the Holocaust, now in its third edition. And I should say, this is one of the most read books on the Holocaust in North America. It's the standard book for university level classes on the Holocaust, and the publisher has already prevailed upon her for a fourth edition. And coming out this year, and you have to love this title, Between God and Hitler, Military Chaplains in Nazi Germany. And we're expecting that from Cambridge University Press this summer. I forgot to thank one important person, and I'm going to do that before I introduce our guest. Edward Kissy of the University of South Florida and I organized this conference together. We had a lot of proposals for this conference, and it was very hard to make choices. And Ed and I are hoping to edit a book from the papers from the conference as well. And Ed's contributions to the discussions have just been wonderful. But I want to introduce my friend. The topic of her talk tonight is It's Been Universal All Along, the Holocaust Global Context. Please welcome Dr. Doris L. Bergen.
Thank you so much, Norm, for the warm introduction. And I also want to thank you and Ed for inviting me to be the keynote at this conference, to repeat the thanks to all the organizers and staff who've made everything go so smoothly. And I also wanted to thank my friends from the former University of Toronto, students and postdocs, Yaniv Feller, Rachel Gordon, Seth Bernstein, all of whom are here, and my friend Jeffrey Giles. So it's great to be here with so many familiar and friendly faces. I have to tell you that after Norm and Ed invited me to give this keynote, I really started thinking about it very hard. I taught an entire graduate seminar on the subject of universalizing the Holocaust to help prepare for this keynote. But unfortunately, even after all that, I'm afraid I have many more questions than answers to offer you today. But I hope it will be stimulating. So first I gotta be able to advance my slide. How come everything worked 2 seconds ago? Oh, and I can just go, yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. There's always something for me. So I organized my talk around 6 aspects of the universal sort of nature of the Holocaust that I identified. You can see, I just listed them right there. What I'm going to do is talk about each of those 3 aspects, if you can call them that, with some examples and explanation, connect a bit to the papers from our conference, and talk about some of the opportunities and challenges of universalizing the Holocaust. So let's go straight to the first one. I called it A World of Misery, Victims' Narratives. In my research and teaching, I try to put people's experiences at the center. Maybe that sounds obvious, but it's actually been quite transformative for the way that I think about scholarship. And I did the same with this topic, thinking about what's universal about the Holocaust. I went first to personal accounts and personal sources by Jews, also by other victims, to think about how did they locate themselves in the world? How did they think about their own experiences? I found that, indeed, many different kinds of people spoke at length in diaries and letters about themselves as part of the world, seeing their experience in a universal context. So the first example I want to show you is from a Polish Jewish adolescent, Molly Applebaum, who spent more than 2 years hidden in a box under the floor of a barn in German-occupied Poland, together with her cousin, who was older. And during that time, she managed to keep a diary, which has been published in English translation under the title Buried Words. It's an incredible book. And I asked Yaniv Feller to read this passage from Molly Applebaum's diary. Thank you, Yaniv. Now, a rather, you could say, more lofty attempt or effort to express what it meant to be situated in a world comes from another Polish Jewish source, Rabbi Talmud of Lublin. In 1942, he wrote a series of theological letters to a former student in which he tried to capture the absolute devastation of the world of Jewish learning of which he was a part, that had shaped his life and his existence. To read this excerpt, we have Rachel Gordon. Thank you. So you see that sense of the destruction of an entire world that he experiences and feels himself part of. There's also expressions, again, from the time of Jews situating themselves in a world of colonialism, situating their own experiences in the Holocaust in a colonial context. Here you see an excerpt from Victor Klemperer, the German professor, born Jewish, converted to Protestantism, but persecuted as a Jew in Nazi Germany. He was fascinated with the Nazis' use of language, and he wrote a book called The Language of the Third Reich. The very first term in that book, the term penal expedition, he defined, you could see here, as so colonial. You could see the encircled Negro village. You could hear the cracking of the hippopotamus whip. So putting the Nazi behaviors in that colonial frame. Another, to me, really interesting example comes from Leon Polyakov, himself a survivor and a historian. He wrote a very early history of the Holocaust called Harvest of Hate, published in 1951. And in it, he recounts hearing from two Auschwitz survivors, two important Jewish thinkers, the historian Joseph Wolfe and the socialist Benedikt Kautsky, how they had discussed inside Auschwitz what would have become of Gandhi in the camp. And now I'm quoting, the speakers agreed that after having been the object of some of the coarse jokes and pranks in which the SS and the Kapos shared, he would have passed into the category of the Muslims. You know, the term Musulman was used in the camp jargon, old German term for Muslim, to mean someone who was like finished, on the verge of death in a few days, and he would have succumbed at the first selection. Thinking about these personal accounts, to me, really illuminates the way in which the Holocaust has been universal all along, including in the perceptions and experiences of those who lived or did not live through it. And yet I noticed in our papers from the conference, only a few of them, and for me, I will say personally, maybe my favorite papers, CD's paper, Anjali's paper, and Sarhid's paper, spoke specifically about individuals, about people. And it seems to me perhaps the challenge of universalizing is to think, how can the universal not be the opposite of the particular? How can we maintain and keep a focus on people's experiences, on the universal that is built in, even to an individual? So let's think about the second theme, world domination, perpetrators' ambitions. I think this is another really important aspect of how the Holocaust has been universal all along. Now, Norm mentioned that we were classmates. In fact, we have the same PhD supervisor, the amazing historian of World War II and the Holocaust, Gerhard Weinberg. And you can see right there from the title of his blockbuster book, A World at Arms, that for him, the global nature of World War II and of the Holocaust is the essence of understanding these events. Weinberg always emphasizes that the Nazis' ambitions were global. They didn't aim to simply destroy the European Jews. They just got stopped because of the war. You know what I mean? As far as they got. And of course, Norm Goda too wrote his first book with the title Tomorrow the World. So the World War itself was a vector, right, of universalization in the times. In addition, Nazi ideology, by its logic, was also universal and all-encompassing. And this is a really important point. not only that Hitler had the ambition of creating a new world order, a world without Jews, but that a conspiratorial idea always linked the perceived enemies of Nazi Germany with one another. I don't want to read this quote because who needs to read all those Hitler words? But if you look at it, you can see how it entangles, right? The notion of the Jewish enemy, the supposed sexual threat of the Jewish man, mixed together with the supposed sexual threat of Black men, all linked in a conspiracy against Germany. So this is the kind of global nature from the point of view of perpetrators' vision. Those global linkages remain extremely live. If you look at the image from Charlottesville, probably most of you remember pretty clearly those events. As that Unite the Right, event was going on, so many people contacted me and said they're chanting Nazi slogans. The slogan that they were chanting was, "Jews will not replace us." It's not a Nazi slogan. I kept hearing that. I'm like, it doesn't even make any sense in the Nazi context. That slogan, it took me very little researching to find, is the slogan of the xenophobic, anti-immigrant, right-wing European movement. And the slogan is not, Jews will not replace us. It is, you will not replace us. You, immigrants, you, Africans, you, Muslims. My theory is what happened there at that event, maybe the people at the front of that marching column, knew that slogan. But because they're carrying those swastika flags, the people further back, they thought they must be saying Jews will not replace us. You know what I'm saying? So it's like a mistaken game of telephone that actually reveals a truth embedded in that movement. And this linkage is also articulated by another, again, incident I'm sure many of you remember very well. Yom Kippur in Halle, Germany, 2019, where a man went to the synagogue intent to murder Jews at prayer, was stopped by the security doors. So he shot a random woman in the street and then went to a Turkish restaurant and tried to kill the owner, but he wasn't there, so he killed a customer. And in his manifesto, what did he say? Quote, "I think the Holocaust never happened. Feminism is the cause of declining birth rates in the West, which acts as a scapegoat for mass immigration. And the root of all these problems is the Jew." So you see there all those hatreds tangled up, the glue that binds them together, being anti-Semitism. Those linkages were recognized at the time, both during the Hitler's era and immediately after. And as is so often the case, they were recognized first by the people with the most at stake. I want to get you to think here about this quotation from the well-known Caribbean thinker, Aimé Césaire, who, it's actually really a poem. He gave that in a lecture in 1945, that it was written down by memory by Frantz Fanon. You could hear this linkage from another perspective, and we're going to hear it from Rachel. Thank you. It's really an amazing passage when you think about, the linkages that Césaire draws our attention to. And here too, I was interested that our papers mostly didn't talk too much about perpetrators. And I was thinking maybe it's sort of, I don't know, out of style to focus on the perpetrators. We do have the papers on law, for example. But yeah, not so much on perpetrators. But I thought that Ed's paper did include this really important point showing that in the time, people in the 5 African countries that you studied, like Aimé Césaire a few years later, or not even like a year later, recognized these linkages, recognized the universal ambitions of Nazi conquest and the implications for those people who would be in the middle of the target. And you can see there the sentence from Ed: of major concern to the African observers and readers of Holocaust news at the time was how the Nazi violence against Jews and attacks on universal institutions like the family foreshadowed the survival of African cultures under potential Nazi rule. So yeah, the subject of perpetrators, I think it's difficult because you have to inhabit in a way that space and that language, but it is really important as well to keep in view. So let me go to the third point on a different direction, maybe thinking about universal history as inclusive history, thinking together about connections between Jews and non-Jews as targets. Now, I was thinking that universal, maybe it's me being too straightforward, I immediately thought about geographic space, right? But universal can also be about people, not only where, but about who. And I think it's valuable to think about the intersections across and between target groups. I just give you one little example. When the Nazis began killing killing people with disabilities, the first target group, within that group, Black, Jewish, Sinti people were the first of the first, if you know what I mean. This is an example of intersections. Or thinking about the contagion of violence, how killers were trained against one group, again, those people who became experts in killing people with disabilities, they moved to become the commanders of killing centers for Jews. And convergence and divergence, how different experiences sometimes connect and other times diverge. And these patterns are really important to study. You know, even that visual, I think of those Nazi triangle symbols, it's quite useful to think about the interlinkages, literally how you can build those triangles on one another, whether communists, Jews, Roma, asocials, and so on. So on the subject of looking at Jews and non-Jews together, I found this photograph really stimulating. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's a photograph that a research assistant found when I asked her to search the photo archives of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum using the keywords disabilities. So this photo came up with the following caption: 5 handicapped Jewish prisoners photographed for propaganda purposes who arrived in Buchenwald after Kristallnacht. So it's a photo taken in 1938, right? Looking at that picture and the caption, I can't help thinking about the universal nature of disability and the way that on this image, the image of disability is completely constructed, if you know what I mean. How do we know that those men weren't posed that way, right? Who took that picture? You know, it was someone in authority, right? They're creating a propaganda image, supposedly to show Jews as infirm, as deformed, as akin to the so-called lives unworthy of life. How do you know that the actual treatment of them didn't create the physical condition? If you know what I mean, maybe they're beaten and kicked to be put into that position. But by labeling them handicapped, you see how one prejudice reinforces another. Jews in 1938, they're not yet being sent to killing centers, but now they're being stigmatized as somehow unworthy of life, as if those with disabilities are unworthy of life. The scholar Susanna Knittel has done, I think, some really interesting and important work as to why is it that the murder, the prejudice and discrimination and murder of people with disabilities and mental illnesses has, in her words, traditionally not formed part of the discourse and memory of the Nazi crimes. She offers a few explanations: the almost total lack of survivors, the stigma of mental illness, and the assumption that in contrast to the racially and politically motivated of Jews, Sinti, Roma, and others, the policies behind the euthanasia program were in some way medically justifiable. Think about it for a minute. You think of all the categories of victim, the one category that literally can include anyone is the category of disability, right? You can walk out your door and be hit by a car, and through no choice of your own, now you find yourself a person living with disability. So this universal category, it seems to me, is so important for thinking about the relevance, the universal relevance of the Holocaust. I put this quotation here because it's one of the few personal accounts from, in this case, a German Aryan, non-Jewish woman who was sterilized because she was considered so-called feeble-minded. And she wrote in her memoir that after being sterilized, she was a target for sexual abuse because people were like, oh, well, we can do anything to her. And what she describes in this passage is that sense of being, we would say now using that word, I guess, gaslighted, right? That this was the experience of, as she said, they would ask you if you didn't realize you were sick. You didn't dare answer, so you decided to keep your mouth shut. The windows were barred, the doors bolted, and you started to rummage around fearfully in your mind, trying to think what you might have done wrong. And again, thinking about this category of mental health and the importance of it in the world that we all inhabit, I think it's a really, really powerful reminder of the universal nature of Nazi violence. Issues of sexuality, I think, are also really important in thinking about an inclusive history. Here I put a picture of the historian Anna Haikova, who interviewed the older woman Margot Heumann, who recently died, who, according to Haikova, is the only Jewish lesbian to be interviewed about her experiences in the Holocaust openly with that frame. And as Haikova notes, the bottom here, the fact that even in the most extreme surroundings, people sought human proximity, intimacy, affection, and sex shows how much sexuality is a key part of human behavior to the very end. So emphasizing the Holocaust as inclusive history, it also emphasizes the human connections and the relevance to everyone. And by the way, an inclusive history also becomes a global history because those vectors link up. And here again, just one small example. Some of you may be familiar with the book on the right by Laurie Marhofer, Racism and the Making of Gay Rights. Marhofer started out to write about the German Jewish sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld and ended writing a book equally as much about the man next to him, Li Shutong, a queer Asian born in Hong Kong but died in Vancouver, a sexologist forgotten and rediscovered. And again, that story too is part of the global movement of people, ideas, and concepts in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So let's look at our fourth theme, global movements of people. I already obviously have gestured in that direction. This is probably the topic that most of our papers, or many of our papers, dealt with, and it's an extremely important topic. You think about one of the vectors of the universal nature of the Holocaust was certainly the movement of refugees, right? The map in the middle, it was made actually for my book, War and Genocide. It's in some ways quite a typical visual that you see of the Holocaust, those arrows representing, how many Jews went to the Soviet Union, Central Asia, to Latin America, and so on, Africa, Canada. The map is an important visual, but of course, behind each of those arrows are the stories of people. And I just put these two photos because I think they capture the one, what's on my left, the Passport to Reprieve. Natalia Alexiou wrote the introduction to that memoir. It is a memoir about a Polish Jewish woman whose immediate family basically made it through the Holocaust because they had Nicaraguan visas. Had any of them ever set foot in Nicaragua? They had not. But they got those visas through passports, not even just visas. They got those passports, and that is part of their story. Nicaragua, part of the story. More familiar is the image on the east side of the map, another Polish Jew, Joseph Fishman, in Shanghai. And again, these stories are key parts of the universal global aspect of the Holocaust. This one from Central Asia, again, so often neglected in our field, the fact that the largest number of Jews survived in Soviet Central Asia. Here a picture of, making matzah for Passover in 1945. Where did you see Jewish children in April 1945 openly preparing for Passover with their families? Not too many places, Soviet Central Asia. And you can read Eliana Adler's book about it. So the topic of migration, refugees, it's extremely important. But I think it's also a challenging topic because in the field of Holocaust studies, at least my perspective is, often I think we've tended to look only at one side of that vector, if you know what I mean, as if Jews were fleeing into empty space, spaces far away, spaces nearby, but spaces in some way like empty or uninhabited. But of course, the spaces are not uninhabited. They had and have their own histories and populations and conflicts and agendas, whether we're talking about Canada or Latin America or East Africa or Palestine. And again, people's lives, I think, give us the insights into those encounters. So here for one small example, we're going to hear from Ginia Kowalski, read by Yaniv. Thank you very much. Thinking about the complexity of the world, right, of migration and arrival, it seems to me it's such a message as to how the field of Holocaust studies, we need so many scholars with different perspectives and different knowledge. We need scholars to make a truly integrated global history with in-depth knowledge of regions and languages, who can reverse the gaze, right? So it's not just looking out in one direction, but looking back. And here I just made this list of people whose works have been influential, really for me, recently. I don't want to read them all, but some are going to come up again. But just draw your attention to some of the kinds of projects that scholars are working on. Chia-Kim Ryan-Sun on the Holocaust in Hong Kong, very little known story. Camilla Collins-Ariza on Caribbean intellectuals' responses to the Holocaust. Sidi Ndiaye, we have here with us, so we've seen his work. Pragya Kaul, working on refugees in empire, Jewish refugees in British India. And thinking about Pragya, I can say that she started working on that topic partly as a result of this photograph, which I found in the Holocaust Museum. You can see Esther Wiig, a Jewish refugee from Prague to India, with no other information. I showed it to Pragya Kaul, who was a MA student with us. She's South Asian herself. And I was like, does this picture communicate anything to you? And it was so fascinating. Like her, the first thing she looked at is, who taught that woman how to tie a sari? Like she saw details in the image that to her sparked an inquiry, like what's happening here? Whereas for me, knowing nothing, it was just a picture, maybe a kind of easily orientalized like image. So lots of really important, great work that's going on right now. I just put these two examples. Anya Duba's book is also mentioned, Ed, in your paper. Recent new work by Roni Ariely, about remembering the Holocaust in South Africa. And I think, yeah, these kinds of works, what they draw our attention to is what I think is not noticed if I, as a historian trained in European history, don't listen to my colleagues who work on the history of the Caribbean or on the history of Africa. I won't read this one, but I'll just tell you and just try a tiny bit. This is an essay by Cynthia MacLeod, a very well-known Surinamese author, novelist, and essayist. And she wrote about her reunion after many decades with her best friend from childhood, a Jewish girl from a refugee family in Suriname. So they'd survived the war there and then gone to Israel. And afterwards, for Judith, Suriname was just a place of cherished, peaceful memories decades later. But for MacLeod, who had lived there her whole life, it was the place where things continued. There was a military dictatorship. And as she said to her, or didn't say to her friend, from my mouth, you will never hear that they built an ugly concrete stockroom in your former garden, your paradise. So yeah, the global movement of people is more difficult, you know what I mean, to study than it seems. So now you can see I've already blurred into point 5, the global movement of ideas, really an important aspect, and we've touched on it in a number of ways already. And just one introductory frame I want to bring out, even though, I don't know, I guess scholars, we have to always think we're discovering everything ourselves, otherwise, what's the point? But the idea of connecting the Holocaust to other cases of violence, it is not new. It is really goes back to the time itself, and people have done it for many different reasons, you can see, including to link to tradition. Is the Holocaust part of Jewish history? To make meaning out of suffering. My favorite example is Franz Werfel, 40 Days of Musadag. I don't know if any of you have read it. A book published in 1933 by an Austrian Jew about the Armenian genocide. That was the most popular book in the libraries of Vilna and Warsaw ghettos. We could talk about that and other reasons to compete and outdo, to gain perspective on one's own suffering, to inspire solidarity. Usually the example given for the multidirectional memory or gaining perspective is from W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American historian, sociologist, and thinker. So I'm not going to read that whole quote, but I just want to draw your attention to what Du Bois wrote, again, 1949, on visiting the Warsaw Ghetto, where he said, quote, "The race problem in which I was interested cut across lines of color and physique and belief and status, and was a matter of cultural patterns, perverted teaching and human hate and prejudice, which reached all sorts of people and caused endless evil to all men." So movement of, you know, ideas, that's a really good example. And of course, the idea that Holocaust ideas could help generate solidarity, something articulated, I think, really powerfully by Martin Luther King Jr. here. Oh, and I thought about it because we saw this, not the same image, but Heschel, Abram Joshua Heschel, together with King and Tamara's paper, "I Pray with My Feet," Heschel's famous words. Here we're looking even earlier, 1958, when Martin Luther King articulated this, I would say, basis of solidarity between African Americans and Jews. And Rachel, once again, thank you. Thank you. It's incredibly powerful articulation, again, of the movement of ideas as a basis for solidarity. The movement of ideas can also be a source of, I think, tremendous insight as to how systems of prejudice and oppression function, of how the people in them find their place in those systems. And again, an African-American thinker, I think, has articulated one of these insights so powerfully. That's the novelist Toni Morrison, here from an interview in 1993. And Yaniv, if you'd read it, please. Thank you. And if you think about the movement of ideas, maybe some people might say, well, does it dilute the Holocaust, truth to move into other contexts? It seems to me the exact opposite, right? It's really an enhancement to think about, the insights and what they mean for Jews and non-Jews, for people of all kinds. It's interesting, though, to think about the question of dilution or appropriation, because often, again, working in my field, I hear people express concern that the Holocaust is being used or, taken up in different ways. But I think it's also important to think about an exchange of ideas rather than ideas moving in one direction. And here I want to draw attention to another scholar, Danielle Christmas, who wrote a dissertation, it's now becoming a book, called Auschwitz and the Plantation, Labor and Social Death in American Holocaust and Slavery Fiction. So Professor Christmas works on American literature and the intertanglement, right, of tropes about slavery and the Holocaust. It's extremely important. About a year and a half ago, I can't remember when, but during COVID, I attended a lecture by Danielle Christmas. So it was a hybrid lecture. She was in the room somewhere giving a talk to an audience. I was listening online with half of the audience, wherever we were, all over the world. And she was talking about her research, again, on these interacting, intersecting tropes within American literature. All of a sudden, the chat was full of an angry listener writing in to say, isn't this anti-Semitism? How can she be comparing what happened to us as Jews to what happened, to Black people in slavery? Isn't this inappropriate? Just going on like this? Only afterwards did it occur to me, the field of Holocaust studies in many ways crystallized in its North American form precisely during the era of civil rights, right? So much of the language and vocabulary of our field is drawn directly from discussions of slavery, including the word slavery, including ways of thinking about race and talking about race, right? These are all parts of an exchange and a movement of ideas. And yet, would someone say you're not allowed to use the word slavery? So it seemed to me it's important with the movement of ideas to think about an exchange or a conversation where you don't get to control what the other person says, right? You get to listen to them and they listen to you, but you can't, it's not a conversation if you control both sides. So last thing on movement of ideas, I've been so struck also by our papers about what I think, maybe it's a naive historian's view, is the potential of literature, art, film to express more subtly or more nuanced kinds of interactions, if you know what I mean. And here I just want to read you one last insight from a very recent, hasn't even been published yet, paper by Yu Wang, translating and writing Auschwitz into Chinese literature. I didn't do any of this research because can't read any of that. But Yu Wang quotes a Chinese writer, Shao Qingfan, talking about the Nobel Prize winner, Holocaust survivor Imre Kertész. And listen to this. It's not that I've almost reached Kertész's level and can be compared to him. fan concluded, all I want to say is that little writers and great writers, Chinese writers and foreign writers, despite their different living environments and levels of achievement, their souls are like leaves floating in eternity. As they float, two leaves may encounter unexpectedly at the crossroad of a certain time and space. It's a way of thinking about the movement of ideas, that perhaps isn't so expected, but maybe fruitful. So to the last point, the universal meaning. You know, my colleague Michael Maris, late colleague Michael Maris, wrote a book called The Lessons of the Holocaust, in which he concluded there are no lessons. There may be things to learn, but to look for hard and fast lessons is an invitation to instrumentalize, to find what you're looking for, and so on. But nonetheless, the quest for meaning is so much a part of Holocaust discourse, and many different sort of universal meanings have been suggested. We heard a paper by Jonathan Alukin about the sort of Christian discourse of the Holocaust among early theologians. And here I wanted to just show like some of these universal meanings that have been ascripted are really about a kind of erasure of Jews. This comes from my work on military chaplains. And the one photo, of course, a very famous photo of, you know, the shooting of a Jewish man was circulated with that label, The Last Jew of Vinica, by German police killing squad. The other photo from a German film in 1958, also in the exact same location. The film is based on a novel by a German military chaplain who served in Vinica, one of the epicenters of violence against Jews. But in his story, the Jews are completely erased, and the drama of the war becomes the drama of heroic Germans trying to uphold moral behavior in the hell of a war that was terrible for everyone. So the idea of like the quest for meaning can go in many, many different directions. And this sort of triumphalist direction is one of them. Maybe I'll skip that one. But with something that has become so universally recognized, it seems to me there really is an important kind of almost, I don't know what the word is, but sense where you have to recognize you can't control all the discourses, right? The Holocaust is so ubiquitous that perhaps sometimes, to look at those searches for meaning and see the human connection within them, or to reject them when, you know, there's just nothing there. That is what maybe we are called to do. Or here, like I say, this response of a Palestinian man who created a exhibit on the Holocaust, signaling we are willing, however hard and challenging it may be, to engage with your history, but we don't abide by your narrative. The last point I want to make about looking for meaning deals with the issue of commonalities. Pictured here, you have two men. The shorter man, a Polish Jewish survivor, now has lived in Canada for many years, Nate Leipziger, who in the last few years has undertaken a number of speaking tours together with Indigenous men, here a man called Eugene Arcand, who are survivors of the residential school in Canada. And what Leipziger has emphasized is not comparing or making hierarchies, but rather commonalities, as he called it, the common experiences, common trauma, and common loss that he has found with interlocutors like Eugene Arcand, or like this man, Ted Fontaine. And Fontaine and Leipziger, again, have spoken together to audiences of thousands of school children in different parts of Western Canada. And one of the most powerful commonalities they found is both those men were abused as children, sexually abused as children. And the kind of empowering message of the two of them together, speaking to groups of children, that commonality, again, is one kind of a search for meaning, not unsettling the importance of the Holocaust, but connecting connecting it to other audiences and other meanings. I'll skip those ones too, though they're very interesting. This issue of the genocide of Indigenous people in Canada and the role that I play as a Holocaust historian, or that our community of Holocaust commemoration can play, has been really very front and center lately, because a number of Indigenous communities have found unmarked graves, sometimes hundreds of unmarked graves, on the sites of former residential schools. And the picture that I'm showing here is a press conference you can see from last month. You can see a tiny blue box on the table in the middle, in the front of the two men with the headdresses. The box contains the jawbone of a 4 or 5-year-old child that was found on the site of a residential school, somehow dated to be 125 years old. So human remains as well as unmarked graves. And thinking about these issues and the challenge that they pose, for finding connections and meaning, I was reminded of a line from the diary of Herman Kruk, a Polish Jewish librarian, actually. He did not survive the war, but his diary, published as The Last Days of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, did. He wrote, talking about murdered Jewish children in Lithuania, "Over the graves of murdered children, poisoned flowers grow." In other words, such a terrible wrong produces, right, so much ongoing suffering. And yet there is something growing there. You know what I mean? Like, the image captures both the impossibility of erasing the wrong and the destruction and the pain, and the necessity of somehow living on, right? And maybe this is one of the meanings that we can take from the Holocaust. I want to end with a personal account again that I think maybe crystallizes many points about the restless, endless search for meaning, a universal quest maybe, and yet a very particular one too. And it's from Gustawa Jarecka. You can see there, a Polish Jewish journalist who was a writer in the Warsaw Ghetto, herself murdered in Treblinka along with her children. But she wrote an essay called "The Last Stage of Resettlement is Death." And to read this passage from it, we have Ed Kissy.
We have forces fastened around our necks. The desire to write is as strong as the repugnance of words. We hate words because they too often have served as a cover for emptiness or meanness. We despise them, for they pale in comparison with the emotion tormenting us. And yet, in the past, the word meant human dignity and was man's best possession, an instrument of communication between people. These documents and notes are a remnant resembling a clue in a detective story. I remember from childhood such a novel by Conan Doyle, in which the dying victim writes with a faint hand one word on the wall containing the proof of the criminal's guilt. We are noting the evidence of the crime. The record must be held like a stone and a history's wheel in order to stop it. One can lose all hopes except the one that the suffering and the destruction of this war will make sense when they are looked at from a distant historical perspective. From suffering unparalleled in history, from bloody tears and bloody sweat, a chronicle of days of hell is being composed, which will help explain the historical reason for why people came to think as they did, and why regimes arose that caused such suffering.
Thank you. And I think Jarecka really articulates the restless, endless search for meaning, a search that I think we engage in, not maybe expecting to find like the one answer, but to find at least some meanings or some connections. So thank you.
We are going to take some questions. Amanda Buffet has the microphone, and if anyone has a question, which you normally do, raise your hand, and Amanda will give you the mic.
Great. Thanks so much, Professor Bergen. This is the question's a little bit it's related to the talk, but I just wanted to ask your perspective on this, given your stature in the field. Could you kind of narrate for the audience, or just for us, how the field of Holocaust studies has related or like engaged with the question of universalization over the years? Like, it seems to me there's been such anxiety and concern for Holocaust historians, the question of universalization, and that peaked potentially in the 1980s. And now, are we past that moment of anxiety? Like, are we embracing universalization, and like we're just, because your talk was clearly saying that like the globe is there in people's migrations, the global transmission of ideas, and that is something to be celebrated. But is there still anxiety and tension among Holocaust survivors over universalization, or no?
Thank you. I have to point out I'm hard of hearing, so that's why I need some help with the questions. Nothing about you, it's my hearing problem. I think the question is really difficult to answer because I think, again, I believe it's the scholar's conceit that we always think we're better than the people who came before us. So the idea is like, oh, we're getting more and more open and universal, but it's not like that. I think if you look at the very earliest studies, which began during the war itself, the question exactly of how universal and how particular was on people's minds. Like if you read Laura Yokush's book, right, about those early Holocaust projects, many Jewish survivors had the idea that if we just talk about a Jewish fate, who else is going to care? Like, we have to connect our story, for example, to the story of the French national resistance or the story of the great Soviet, citizens who rose up. And so like that discussion about what should be particular and what should be universal, it is a very, very old discussion, and it's not new. So, and I think the same is true with the anxieties. It's like, again, there's so many different, perspectives, including among survivors. I'll tell like one little story. Maybe it's not a good answer because it's an anecdote, but for me, this is what I think. So my first job was at the University of Vermont, which was a fantastic place, whatever. And, Vermont is pretty close to Montreal. Montreal, there's quite a large number of Holocaust survivors in Montreal. And when Daniel Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, came out in the mid-1990s, I was invited to Montreal to speak to a group of child survivors. Obviously, they were no longer children by then. They were, whatever. And none of them had read the book yet. They wanted to talk about the book. They hadn't read it. So I told them, look, the argument of the book is that Germans were motivated by a uniquely German eliminationist anti-Semitism. So, they thought about it. It was a group of maybe 30 survivors, all of them survivors. And the first person said, I like this book. Goldhagen's own father is a survivor. He's not mincing words. He's making it clear the Germans, the anti-Semitism, it was specifically about Jews. I think it's a really good book. Another person put up their hand and said, the problem is, if it's only about us, why is anyone else going to listen? So, so even within that small group of people, there was a discussion of, wait, if we focus on this uniquely German, and then a third person put up their hand and said, forget about uniquely German. My family's from Romania. Let me tell you about anti-Semitism. Then the competition started. So it was like, Romania? How about Ukraine? They're like, forget about it. How about Lithuania? And so people had many different views. You know what I mean? And so I think it's not a neat arc. And you can easily draw it that way. But at every stage, you can find scholars of the Holocaust who have insisted on, for example, Henry Friedlander, insisted we need to talk about the murder of people with disabilities, and we need to talk about the murder of Roma. You can find others who have said, no. And there were huge fights at the Holocaust Museum in DC. No, there should not be anything about those groups. This museum should be about Jews. Other people are like, no, that has to be in there. So I think this discussion, and in a way, I think it's really good because the discussion is really important because it does get at, like, you need a special, what can I say, perspective and training to understand Rabbi Talmud. You know what I mean? Like, that is a part of the Holocaust that is really specifically Jewish. And even within, I don't know, Jewish studies, if you can call it that, Orthodox Jews, they're totally neglected in Holocaust studies. So yeah, the long answer is, it's a great question because it's really hard to answer. And both things coexist, converge, diverge, all the way through.
I wonder if you have, I wonder if you have reflections about the ways that, general memorial culture and not just historians do this. I mean, I'm thinking about, we now have a multiplication of Holocaust Memorial Days. November 9th, Yom HaShoah, now January 27th, since about 2000, first the European Union, now the UN. Can you put it in a context? I mean, is this generated by the public, by politics, or by historians?
I think I got all the keywords. Who's generating that multiplicity? I don't know. I wish I knew the answer, but I think the answer is all of the above. Maybe not historians so much, but I think it's like institutionalization brings its own momentum. You know what I mean? So if you think about one of the, I think, again, from my perspective, I have an endowed chair. It is like such a fantastic position to be in. You know what I mean? Where you think like my position is recognized by my university, by, generous donors who gave that funding, by, people in the community. But I think institutionalization does, in a way, generate activity. You know what I mean? Because if you're going to have centers for Holocaust studies, if you're going to have Holocaust museums, of course, you got to have programming. I don't know if that goes for the formal dates, but it's interesting. Like, I remember some years ago, Dan Mickman from Israel, he gave a talk and he was talking about how many Holocaust commemorative dates are on the calendar, on the Israeli calendar. There's also, quite a few of them. But yeah, I think the answer really is all of the above, because you think sometimes there's political reasons, sometimes there's international, like International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Well, that's in January. Some years we didn't do an event on that day at our university because we're like, oh, there's a local Holocaust center. They have a great event. Let's support that. This year, the dean, should I be saying this on the YouTube? Maybe this won't. Called our Center for Jewish Studies and said, aren't you going to do something for International Holocaust Remembrance Day? So the impetus can come for different kinds of reasons. And sometimes it can be as simple as, again, excuse me if I'm being too open, but, there have been anti-Semitic incidents on campus, and it's an easy way for the leadership to show we're going to do something, we're going to support this Holocaust-related event. So I think the answer is really a complex one as well, and probably both specific to, there's one other factor too, which is, when other places are doing things, then you got to do something too. You know what I mean? Like, we have another great university in Toronto, York University. We have great relations, our Jewish Studies Center, their Jewish Studies Center. We sometimes do events together, but we also look at each other's programming. You know what I mean? It's like, wait, they're doing a big thing. Maybe we should be doing something. So I do think there's a lot of different factors. Yeah, that maybe isn't a satisfying answer, but that's the best I can come up with.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make a personal comment and also a question that is somewhat tangential, but not entirely. Personally, I'm as are probably a number of people here, the son of Holocaust survivors, and all of my close family who I knew were Holocaust survivors, and the others of whom I didn't know were killed. But I realized as you were talking particularly about the the parallels that are drawn between slavery and the Holocaust is that my parents were slaves. I mean, they were slave labor, as were many survivors as well. But I have another very tangential comment or question, and that has to do with, it occurred to me, the currently repellent attempts to universalize apartheid. But it's not truly being universalized because in the statement or the sort of universalizing definition of the systematic oppression of one race by another, which I think is the kind of broad definition that's used in this extension of apartheid into Israel in particular, that in fact, that definition applies worldwide, or at least in many places, China being one of the notable current examples. And I wonder about the more broad attempts to, or impetus to universalize oppression across many different dimensions and examples. So I just raised that, and I wonder if you have any comments. Okay.
I hope I understood the question correctly. Like, are you asking about like the fact that oppression is so universal and that if you talk with such a broad category, you lose something? Was that the gist?
But also, okay, that could be one sort of direction of discussion. But also, I think one sees a number of attempts to universalize different experiences of oppression and of genocide and of violence.
Yeah. I think I think
in other words, is this a good or a bad thing?
I think the answer is yeah. Okay, I hope I'm answering the right question. I think the answer is both, because what I'm really trying to get at, and I will tell you, I also teach, so I teach a course on the Holocaust, and I also teach a course, it's a small course on religion and violence in comparative perspective. It's sort of like a comparative genocide class. And to me, it seems like what's so important in that class is both things, like both to think about the commonalities, you know what I mean? The way in which thinking about the Armenian genocide, for example, really can help you think about the Holocaust in new ways, That's just one, so thinking about the commonalities is super important. And also thinking about the specificities is super important. So to me, it seems like you need both of those two things. And whether it's two different groups of people, you know what I mean? Different types of scholars, that's one way. Or whether as a scholar, or just a person thinking, you try to move back and forth between those two levels. You know what I mean? So you move between thinking, yeah, my parents were slave laborers. There was something very specific about that context, but there's also something shared in the history of slavery, right? That you can think about across a broad perspective. So I think the universalization has to always be paired with the attentiveness to the particular, if that makes sense, because otherwise you flatten everything out to the same. And then it's like, well, what's the point? You know what I mean? If everything is the same, there's nothing to understand. But if you only look at the particular, I think you easily fall into a competition or hierarchy, you know what I mean, of suffering. So I think the moving between the universal projects and the particular projects is maybe the way forward. I don't know.
I just have a quick question, 2 details. What happened to Molly Applebaum? Did she get out of the box? And what does Sinti mean? Thank you.
These are excellent questions. Yes, Molly Applebaum got out of the box, and so did her cousin. She, complicated stories, she moved to Canada. She still lives in Toronto. And you can read, so her book, Buried Words, is both her diary written at the time, which is incredible. You could probably get a little sense of the flavor. And she wrote a memoir many years later where she, well, part of the reason was she nominated those Polish brother and sister who had that farm as righteous among the nations. And it's a complicated story, which I won't tell you more about, but you could look it up online, Molly Applebaum. So she lives in Toronto. We actually gave her a prize last year at my university, back to why it's cool to have an endowed chair. We created a prize, the Student Impact Award she was the first person we gave it to. So it's like Molly Applebaum received the Student Impact Award for her work and, her work on just Holocaust memory. So yeah, that's Molly Applebaum. Oh, wait, before I ask her, Sinti, we're giving the second, and Norm, you better be there on Zoom. We're giving the second Wolfe Chair Student Impact Award this year to Gerhard Weinberg. And that's another event. Yeah, so Sinti is like Sinti and Roma, a Roma group, but German speaking Sinti. So in the German context, people talk about like Sinti for often, like Romani people who German speaking based in Central Europe. So sometimes people say Sinti and Roma. Now some is more and more just Roma, Romani. We're good, right? Thanks for a wonderful. And thanks to my great readers, Rachel, Yaniv, and Ed. Thank you so much.